Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third Australian Renewable Fuels Week. I'm Shahana McKenzie, CEO of Bioenergy Australia, for those of you that I haven't met. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which this library was built. We pay our respect to Aboriginal elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to other First Nations people who may be here today. Before we begin, I get the job of housekeeping. It's all the fun stuff. Bathrooms located outside. You go past the glass house near the lockers. In an emergency, follow instructions from the library wardens, proceed to the nearest safe fire exit and gather outside at the Domain Park on Hospital Road. Now, Australian Renewable Fuels Week, for those of you that have been attending in the last few years, you would know that this is not possible without our sponsors. So we would love to thank the New South Wales Government, who are our government partner for this event, our platinum sponsors, BP, LanzaJet and Australian Gas Infrastructure Group, gold sponsors, Gemina, CEFC, Neste, Argus Media, Green Power, Licella and LMS Energy, and our event sponsor, the Queensland Government, who had to come down, of course. I would also like to acknowledge Green Power for matching the electricity used at the conference with 100% Green Power renewable electricity to support this event. I would also like to acknowledge the speakers that have travelled this year. So we have more international speakers this year than we ever have, and interstate speakers who have also made the effort to come. In particular, I would like to thank those who are travelling here from Queensland, Brisbane and the Gold Coast, who are suffering at the moment from some extreme weather, and we really appreciate you making the effort to come down, leaving your families and the like. As I said, this is our third Australian Renewable Fuels Week and our largest, with over 400 registrations, and it's looking to be filled with election commitments throughout the week. Pretty exciting. The first is to announce the Albanese government's Feeding Australia strategy that was announced today. At 8:30 this morning, so 20 minutes ago. This is an election commitment and it represents a significant opportunity for Australia's bioenergy sector. This initiative isn't just about the importance of food security, it's an opportunity to position Australia as a world leader in feedstock production and the development and deployment of low-carbon liquid fuels. In addition to strengthening supply chain resilience and curbing price volatility at the checkout, the government has pledged to strategically examine the potential for a biofuels feedstock industry to support Australia's transition to net zero. I would now like to introduce, unfortunately, Minister Chris Bowen couldn't make it this morning. I will be seeing him tonight, and fingers crossed we are going to hear an announcement tomorrow morning. But we do have a very short video as a welcome from him.
Hi everyone, I'm sorry I can't be with you at Renewable Fuels Week. I'm actually here today in Brisbane, where I've just announced $2 million of support for Viva and sustainable aviation fuel, and also support for the making of sustainable aviation fuel in Bundaberg. Well, it's been a big year. Low carbon liquid fuels been recognised as a priority area under the Future Made in Australia Act and included in the Innovation Fund. The Guarantee of Origin scheme passed the Parliament. Not easy, but got it done. And also, even just this week, good steps forward for the renewable diesel industry. So, we've done a lot, but you know and I know there's a whole lot more left to do. We've only just started this journey. So together, let's finish the job over the next 2 years. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Minister Bowen. Hopefully we can start talking about the job that needs to be done tomorrow with the announcement, which we're very much looking forward to. I would now, to kick off this first session, I am delighted to introduce Flyn, who everybody in the room knows already. So he is the Regional Director, Asia Pacific for LanzaJet and our platinum sponsor for today.
Thank you, Shahana. Let me start by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians. I recognise their cultures, history and diversity, and their deep connection to the lands, waters and seas. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians on the land in which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here today. So as Shahana mentioned, I do know a lot of people in the room, and it's great to see so many familiar faces. For those I'm meeting for the first time, I am the Regional Director for LanzaJet in Asia Pacific, and it's my pleasure to help welcome you here to the opening day of Australian Renewable Fuels Week, which we have the honour of supporting. This event brings together industry leaders, policymakers and innovators who share a common goal, which is accelerating the transition to low-carbon liquid fuels. I would also like to acknowledge Senator David Van, Senator for Victoria, who you'll hear from shortly. And I'd also like to thank Shahana and the entire team at Bioenergy Australia for all the work that's gone into this week's event. So LanzaJet is committed to scaling SAF production through our ethanol-to-jet technology. Our process leverages widely available low-carbon ethanol to produce drop-in SAF that can be used in today's aviation infrastructure. By converting ethanol into SAF, we are helping bridge the gap between available feedstocks and growing global demand for SAF. Our technology is not just about creating an alternative to conventional jet fuel, it's about doing so in a way that is cost-effective and globally impactful. Our first commercial plant, Freedom Pines Fuels in the United States, is demonstrating how ethanol-to-jet technology can be deployed at scale. Our goal is to expand production worldwide, and you'll hear more from my colleague Renee Wooten in the second session about LanzaJet and what we're doing here in Australia and across the Asia Pacific region. So beyond the decarbonisation of the aviation sector, one of the most significant benefits of SAF is its ability to enhance energy security. Many countries in the Asia Pacific region, including Australia and New Zealand, rely almost exclusively on imported crude oil and refined products. This dependence creates economic vulnerabilities and exposes nations to geopolitical risks, an issue that was on the front pages last week with China's Navy conducting live-fire drills in the Tasman Sea. By investing in SAF production, Australia, New Zealand and our regional partners can build a more self-sufficient and resilient energy supply chain. LanzaJet's ethanol-to-jet technology in particular enables the use of domestically sourced and sustainable feedstocks. SAF also presents a tremendous economic development opportunity. A robust SAF industry will create jobs across multiple sectors, including agriculture, refining, logistics and aviation. Investments in SAF production facilities will spur regional development, particularly in rural areas where feedstock cultivation and processing can drive local economies, something that we are seeing play out right now in rural Georgia, where Freedom Pines Fuels is located. Because of these strategic benefits, the global SAF market is evolving rapidly and we're seeing strong momentum in Asia Pacific. Airlines, fuel producers and governments across the region are recognising the importance of securing a reliable, renewable fuel supply to support economic growth and energy independence. Asia Pacific is also the world's fastest growing aviation market, making it a critical player in the future of SAF. And countries such as Japan, Singapore, Thailand, South Korea and Malaysia have already taken proactive steps to advance SAF adoption. Japan, for instance, has established a target of 10% by 2030, and to ensure this is achieved, the Japanese government is offering financial incentives such as capex subsidies for 50% of the capital cost of an A to J plan. We are particularly pleased to be partnering with Cosmo Oil, who last week announced that they would be the recipient of the support being provided by the government in Japan. Most of you would also be aware that Singapore will be implementing a SAF levy on airline tickets, the proceeds of which will be used to purchase and deliver SAF to Changi Airport, initially with the goal of 1% by 2026, rising to 2 to 5% by 2030. And last year, Thailand released a draft energy plan that contemplates a SAF mandate being implemented in 2026. We expect the government to finalise those plans this year following further industry consultation. South Korea, the fifth largest global refining market in the world and the largest exporter of jet fuel, has also announced plans for a SAF mandate, but perhaps more significant is their strategic goal of being the world's largest exporter of SAF by 2030. New Zealand, which under the previous government had proposed a SAF mandate, is also beginning to recognise the strategic importance of SAF. And as a country heavily reliant on aviation for both domestic and international connectivity, SAF presents an opportunity for New Zealand to enhance its energy security while maintaining strong economic ties with global markets. The same holds true for us here in Australia. The federal government has made a series of announcements demonstrating its commitment to building a domestic SAF industry, This includes support through the Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund. The Jet Zero Council has also played a particularly important role of bringing together key stakeholders to advance policy discussions, and the government's commitment to explore supply-side and demand-side measures necessary to stand up a domestic industry has been particularly welcome. Despite all this momentum, SAF production still accounts for only 1% of global jet fuel demand. And to meet the industry's goals for 2030, we need to scale up production dramatically. This means we must take decisive action in 2025 to ensure we are on track. For this to happen, 2025 needs to be a year of increased production capacity, with more SAF plants coming online and significant investments across all SAF pathways. Stronger policy frameworks, including mandates, incentives, funding programs to encourage SAF adoption, de-risk investments, and support the flow of private capital. We are fortunate in this part of the world to have airlines that are leading and have set ambitious targets. We need other airlines in the region and across the world to follow that lead. And investment in innovation with continued R&D in feedstock availability and process efficiencies for new SAF technologies. If we get to 2025 right, we will be well on our way to achieving the 2030 targets. So in closing, the future of SAF in Australia, New Zealand and the broader Asia-Pacific region is incredibly promising. The momentum is there, the technology is proven, the industry is ready to scale, and importantly, we have the feedstock. But achieving this vision will require continued commitment, investment and collaboration between governments and industry. So I would now like to introduce the first session, the essential role of low carbon fuel in emissions reduction and energy security. So to get us started, I'm delighted to introduce Senator David Van, Senator for Victoria, Parliament of Australia, to speak on Australia's fuel security and energy resilience.
Thank you very much, Flynn, and I hope you'll all forgive the voice today. As one wag put it, I think I asked too many questions in Senate estimates last week about why we don't have a sovereign fuel production industry here yet. Since being elected to the Senate in 2019, I've devoted all my efforts into two policy areas, and that is energy and national security. Where these two intersect in energy security has long been a passion of mine. Why? Because I don't believe you can have national security without energy security. Historically, our industries, agriculture, homes, hospitals, all once depended on one or more fuel sources to produce other forms of power, e.g. coal to generate electrical power, gas to produce heat, or liquid fuels to drive mechanical power. Now, our energy mix is undergoing a rapid transition while we decarbonise. While how we generate energy is evolving, our reliance on energy is increasing, and the vulnerabilities ensuing from this are growing exponentially. If you then consider the growing number and significance of threats to our energy supply, it is hard not to be a little alarmed, if not a lot. Last year, I chaired a Senate inquiry into energy planning and regulation in Australia, and that tabled its findings just before Christmas. The inquiry found that our transition to a net zero economy is at risk of potential significant setbacks as energy planning is flawed, particularly with regard to having enough clean electricity, and that is generation and storage, enough to replace our carbon-fuelled generation. This is significant because if we can't decarbonise our electricity sector, then the other harder to abate sectors will fail to decarbonise. As industrial processes that won't be able to displace carbon fuels through electrification and fuel and feedstock substitutes, such as hydrogen, won't be available. And hydrogen is a clear case in point, as you can't have green hydrogen without green electricity, and the obvious flow-on impacts such as through ammonia and green methanol. And we are already seeing hydrogen hit some significant headwinds with the cancellation of a number of large projects, and this is despite billions of dollars in government support through programs such as Hydrogen Head Start and the recently legislated Future Made in Australia production tax credits. Now, I supported those tax credits through the Senate, but I also fought very hard to have renewable fuels included to have those production tax credits. I put forward an amendment in that legislation to ensure that those tax credits were included, but they were voted against by both the government and opposition, I'm sad to say. And now, don't get me wrong, I fully support a hydrogen industry, and I hope it lives up to the hype of making Australia a hydrogen superpower. However, let's be clear, hydrogen is not central to our national security, and even if it was, the supply chain to deliver it isn't particularly vulnerable. What is vital to our national security and is incredibly vulnerable are liquid fuels, especially diesel and aviation fuel. I'm sure others will provide detailed figures of the fuel use and type by industry, but the one figure that concerns me is that 90% of our liquid fuels, or 80% if I read the Deloitte program yesterday correctly, is imported by sea. Yes, I acknowledge that we've legislated domestic and international obligations to hold reserves. And I think that it's a safe bet there'll be plenty of debate during this conference as to whether we're meeting those obligations or not. Yes, the government have recognised the need to increase storage, particularly in defence. And the 2024 Integrated Investment Plan that accompanied the National Defence Strategy provides for the government to invest between $3.7 and $4.8 billion in improvements to develop and enhance fuel holdings and storage and distribution capabilities for our ADF. However, the problem this enormous investment doesn't address is that you still need to ship that fuel here. The 2023 Defence Strategic Review highlighted, and I quote, "the advantages and vulnerabilities of various international sources of supply and shipping routes of fuel is enormous." In reality, all our shipping routes are vulnerable in this age of geostrategic uncertainty. And yes, you can reroute ships, but as the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea showed us over the last 12 months or so, even a relatively unsophisticated force can cause disruption and impose massive costs and economic shock. And let me be clear, we do not need outright conflict for geopolitical competition to affect our fuel security. Nor does Australia even need to be involved in any conflict to suffer the impacts of any disruption. A mere increase in regional tensions can be enough to induce hesitancy in the mind of shipping companies and, most likely, their insurers, that such a scenario could directly impact Australia's fuel supply chains, especially given that we only have such a minimal buffer, leaving us dangerously exposed to pricing volatility and potential supply shortages. By way of a threat example, just consider the ongoing and escalating tensions between China's Coast Guard and the Philippines Navy at a tiny little feature in the South China Sea called the Second Thomas Shoal. This is an area where the Chinese Coast Guard are using violent tactics to force the Philippines Navy off a makeshift garrison, which is quite literally a Philippines naval ship run aground on an atoll, in order to seize and claim that land feature in the South China Sea and continue their land grab in that area. Each new standoff in that space ratchets up the risk of a flashpoint incident that could disrupt our regional trade. We only need to see a Chinese Coast Guard vessel accidentally ram, which they have done, and this time sink a Philippine Navy ship, or some other violent incursion to escalate a broader conflict, which would trigger immediate repercussions for shipping lanes through and around the South China Sea, and especially the nearby choke points, such as the Straits of Malacca, which is where all our fuel is coming through. Yes, the Philippines has a defence treaty with the United States, which one would hope would give the Chinese pause to avoid escalation. But as I wrote my master's last year, China doesn't only have the world's largest navy, which it does, but that is dwarfed by the size of its maritime militia. This is a fleet comprised of hundreds, if not thousands, of commercial ships, transports, ferries, even fishing vessels, most with dual capability, and all under the command of the People's Liberation Army Navy. These ships undertake grey zone tactics, which China has demonstrated is highly capable of conducting hybrid warfare that is utterly effective in meeting its objectives, while avoiding escalation to full conflict. Given that as we said before, over 80% of Australia's fuel is imported, and most arrives via these highly contested sea lanes of communication, any disruption in these crucial waterways could have severe consequences for our energy security. So my question is, why risk it? Why rely on foreign supply sources shipped by non-Australian owned or flagged ships through vulnerable shipping lanes? Why is being reliant on other countries worth the risk? And I would answer, no, it's not. And one only has to look to Ukraine to understand the dangers of foreign dependency. Now, not many of you probably know, but I've been to the front lines of the war in Ukraine, down in Donbass, and I've met the soldiers fighting there who are extremely thankful for foreign weapons, such as the Bushmasters that we supply. But as their defence ministry told me, they would much rather be self-reliant on weapons and other war stocks. And at least they had a reasonable native weapons manufacturing base before the war. We don't have any of that. And I think it's safe to say that the events at the Oval Office this past weekend should serve as a stark reminder to whoever is in government after the next election that we must be striving for self-reliance, particularly in fuel, but also in weapons. And when it comes to fuel security, we must start to build this self-reliance now. And I think this room is part of the answer. Those of you gathered here today are testament to Australia's innate ability to build that self-reliance and produce both sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. We clearly have the technology, we have the skills, we have abundant feedstocks, and that gives us an enormous comparative advantage. And we also have the ability to use what we produce straight away. As I said earlier, I very much support creating a hydrogen industry in Australia, but that is a much harder proposition than building a fuel industry. Hydrogen not only will require massive changes in industry and infrastructure, but there's still an enormous way to go to build the markets that will take the offtake of that production. Renewable fuels already has this ready to go. And I think at the core of this is Australia's lack of a comprehensive energy strategy. Our energy planning in all the various bits of our energy infrastructure is fragmented, reactive, and fails to address the long-term fuel security. If we had an energy strategy that emboldens an agnostic approach to technology, one focused on maintaining energy security, including liquid fuels, while decarbonising our economy, it would show that we need onshore refining capability. And I don't believe that there is a significant ideological divide between the two parties, but neither side is seized with the urgency that this important part of our energy mix requires. So, in closing, I ask that whoever wins the upcoming election I urge them to urgently bring renewable fuel production support to the National Security Committee of Cabinet and start focusing on what's important to Australia, and that's our energy security.
Thank you, Senator Van. So I'd now like to introduce our remaining speakers. So we will hear from, in order, Dr. Gerard Ostheimer from the Biofuture Council and the Molecule Group. He will be followed by Jeremy Moorhouse from the International Energy Agency via video link. Emily Marthaler from Growth Energy will be next, and then to close us out will be Stephen Forshaw from Airbus. So please welcome Dr. Gerard Ostheimer.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Shahana for the gracious invitation, and then I would like to commend the Senator for the clarity of his vision and the economy of his presentation. Extremely clear, and I will be, frankly, building on the Senator's remarks. While the Senator is in the room, I will actually give Australia a call to action. So my role in the world is I recruit industry into international processes like the G7, the G20, and the Clean Energy Ministerial in particular. And I would say that on the topic of sustainable fuels, Australia has an opportunity essentially to have the world community finance the development of your energy security. However, Australia is oddly silent on the topic of fuels on the international stage. And so, speaking very frankly, I encourage the Senator to look into that if at all possible, if that's in your remit, sir. All right, so I just did that. I would like to say that, I'm actually speaking twice today, so I am running into the challenge of not repeating myself. But I'm going to break my two talks into two sections. The first section is going to focus on more of an emerging market or developing economy context, and then tomorrow I'll be talking more specifically to an OECD or developed country context. And I would like to just sort of summarize everything right up front and just say that mandating reduced GHG emissions is necessary but not sufficient to drive biofuels uptake. So CORSIA is wonderful, it's a very clear signal, but it is insufficient to get the plants built. Proper evaluation of environmental and social attributes is necessary. So to elaborate on this, obviously there's a lot of certification regimes that focus on the carbon intensity of a fuel, that focus on ensuring that there are broader environmental sustainability or sustenance of the system that's producing the fuels. But we have a real challenge, and we know that we've had a real challenge in terms of valorizing carbon for a very long time. One need only look at the price of carbon in the current Australian markets. That's just far too low as an example of our inability to properly structure markets for carbon, and frankly, the inability to properly get the accounting correct. But what we need to think about is also, how do we valorize energy security? How do we as an industry communicate to the broader public and communicate to politicians that they need to value energy security and express that value through the policies they put into place? And then I would like to point out that when we talk about sustainability with biofuels, there is a very strange inversion of reasoning. When we talk about sustainability, we tend to do so consistently on the back foot. This is wrong. This should not be the case. The oil sector should be on the back foot. Frankly, it's bizarre that the biofuels has to be 1,000-fold more defensive and more precautionary when it comes to biofuel production and use. And so we as a community can also revisit how we do our communication so that people are much more clear on the sustainability benefits, and then particularly the broader attributes, because recall, sustainability is not just environmental, but it's social and economic too, and these must be reflected and properly valorized. Okay, and now what I would like to say is that emerging markets can get biofuels right, but frankly, I would include Australia as an emerging biofuel market, right? So you don't have a high-functioning biofuel market at this point. You don't have a well-enforced federal mandate, and so you're no different than a lot of other countries with tremendous, almost absurd feedstock potential, like, say, Zimbabwe or Kenya or Mozambique, but you don't actually have a vigorous existing biofuels market. So, oh, sorry, I borrowed this slide from Jerry Moorhouse. He's probably going to show it in a second. Anyway, the point is that one of the columns in the far right is the fact that a lot of the growth potential, and this was alluded to by Flyn, is going to come from the global south, including Southeast Asia. Now, this ridiculously busy slide from the International Maritime Organization, I want you to just focus on 2025. In 2025, which is this year, IMO has been doing a lovely job of moving forward on sustainable fuels. They seem to have learned from the pain and the trench warfare of ICAO, and they are, at the end of this year, in autumn of 2025, I believe they're pacing themselves for COP30, adoption of midterm measures, and they're already planning an extraordinary session. So I like that forethought, that they know they're going to be calling an extraordinary session, because I think that maritime is also a sector which Australia could really engage in, and many of you might know that the price point on maritime of the selling of the biofuels is frequently less, because you don't have to go to the extensive refining that you do with SAF. All right. So this is stolen from Corsia. This is their adoption timeline. So the countries in green, including Australia, are those that are participating as of 2024. And I'd like to draw your attention to East Africa. I think the East Africans have figured out that you can get the rest of the world to subsidize the growth of your sector, right? Why? Because if you're Ethiopian Airlines or Kenyan Airlines, or if you're going to sell into the Middle East, if we have a functioning book and claim system, if we have a high-functioning international book and claim system, whether it's Los Angeles, whether it's Sydney, or whether it's in Addis Ababa, it'd be perfect if you could fuel up there and then use the environmental attributes somewhere else in the world. And so frankly, I think that this is something that the Australian government should use the G20 to push forward. Okay, so I'd also like to point out that the African Union is quite serious, that it has, as of 2 weeks ago, it has adopted a strategy for sustainable fuels and transportation pathways with a tremendous emphasis on growing the African aviation sector. But they also have gotten all the memos regarding job creation, and then, of course, they do posit the need and the opportunity around a green economy, which sounds an awful lot like the situation in Australia. Okay, and so now what I would like to tell you is that you have a lot of allies. And so for many years, actually, for going on 10 years, it's been unanimous, whether you look at the Global Bioenergy Partnership, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Energy Agency, UNIDO, UN Industrial Development Organization, UNEP. It is unanimous across all international organizations which are committed to the betterment of the human condition that biofuels are part of the solution. So all of these entities are guarding your left flank. So who's on your left flank? On your left flank, you have the environmentalists, many of them the extreme climate activists that are resistant to the use of biofuels because they perceive this as not a reality or evidence-based solution, but they perceive it as we're all, just so you know, we're all in the pockets of big oil. But that is their viewpoint. And on the right flank, we actually have big oil, right? So we're getting it from both sides. So on the right flank, big oil will often try to undercut adoption of sustainable fuels because that will cut into their profits. And then on the left flank, we have the environmentalists. So we're in a tough spot, but I think we have the evidence to go forward. All right, so I'll be wrapping up, and here I want to just say that what we've seen is that in the last 4 years, starting in Indonesia in 22, India in 23, Brazil in 24, and now the G20 is hosted in South Africa, we've had 4 consecutive years with a tremendous focus on sustainable fuels and a focus on their benefits for emerging markets. The G20 witnessed the creation of the the one in India witnessed the creation of the Global Biofuels Alliance and the joining of the African Union into the G20 process. I'll tell you in a second more about Brazil, but now even this year, the G20, there's a real focus on energy security, just and affordable and inclusive energy transition, all of which support the increased production and use of sustainable fuels, whether e-fuels, hydrogen-based, or biofuels. So if we look at the Brazilians did this entire community a huge favor by really focusing oh no, no backwards. Yes, backwards. All right, so really focusing the world's attention, and this resulted in the communique that came out from the G20 energy ministers. And here is the key issue that the world is focused on. So I'm here to report, and I'll elaborate on this more tomorrow. The world is really, really, really focused on getting life cycle accounting correct. Why? Because everybody understands that for consumers and governments to make intelligent investment and purchasing decisions, they need to be able to do an apples-to-apples comparison. We need to compare the climate benefits of hydrogen to the climate benefits of e-fuels to the climate benefits of biofuels, and then, of course, then we weight that against their price, their carbon intensity, and we can do that balancing, and we can figure out which is the fuel that we want to buy. So hydrogen is not getting a sort of a free lunch on the sustainability route anymore, and the governments of the G20 at least are extremely interested in getting this right, and this will be an enabler for the sector. Okay, and so I just want to point out, I am almost done, I want to point out that we are very much on the road to COP30 at this point, and that there's a series of events that I'll be talking about tomorrow that all of you can engage in. I'm very happy to say that LanzaJet just signed up to be a roundtable sponsor of the European Forum that we'll be having in June. And I'll just finish by some call to action for Australia, which I've already said, but to just be clear, I encourage Australia to engage the G20 and the clean energy ministerial process. I'll talk about this more tomorrow. I think that all governments that are giving aid, whether Japan, whether Australia, US, we don't do that anymore, Britain, et cetera, that we should focus on the ag-energy interface, and that I'll be telling you more about this Wednesday, that there's a lot more work that can be done to strengthen the evidence base for biofuels to enable Australian energy security and jobs, jobs, jobs. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and greetings from IEA headquarters in Paris. Thank you very much for accommodating a virtual presentation today. What I'd like to go through with you is the IEA's view on what it's going to take to accelerate sustainable fuel use around the world. Now, we see sustainable fuels as one of the pillars of the energy transition. In our net zero scenario, they double to 2030 and then double again to 2050. And by 2050, they provide 85 exajoules of energy, which is equivalent to global electricity demand today, and fully 1/4 of total energy use in 2050. So a very critical part of the energy transition. Now, one of the main reasons that they expand so quickly is that they're critical to a number of different sectors. In the aviation and shipping sector, sustainable fuels provide 75% of total energy use, and in the industrial sector, 25% of total energy use. Now, critical to this level of growth is commercializing new technologies, and that really needs to start happening over the next decade to 2030 to lay the groundwork for this quick acceleration out to 2050. Now, I don't have the road sector on here. Biofuels especially play a very important role in the road sector today, and then as we move towards 2030 and 2035. past 2035, electrification really becomes the dominant pathway in the road sector. And then we see liquid biofuels starting to play much more of a role in the aviation and shipping sectors. Now, that's the role we would like sustainable fuels to play, but none of these fuels are on track with our net zero scenario. Every year we take a stock of all the different policies around the world, all of the projects that are being planned to be built around the world, and then compare it with this net zero trajectory. For all of the sustainable fuel pathways, they're not aligned with that trajectory. We do see growth across the board and even an acceleration, but not at the scale that we would want to see to meet net zero. Liquid biofuels and biogases, less of a gap to close, in part because those technologies and those fuels are already widely used around the world. Renewable hydrogen and e-fuels, though, require considerable attention to start expanding their use to 2030, which again lays the groundwork for further growth out to 2035. I'll draw your attention to renewable hydrogen right now in the kind of red box there. That's the use of renewable hydrogen in non-energy sectors, so things like fertilizer production. This is critically important on the renewable hydrogen side that it can be used as a feedstock for these other sectors. Now, what we think is necessary for this quicker expansion is 5 main things. What's missing is a global vision for sustainable fuels and the role that they can play. We have a very good sense of what renewable electricity can achieve, energy efficiency, and methane reductions, but we're missing that same level of understanding for sustainable fuels. We also need a shared definition of what sustainable fuels mean around the world. There are dozens and dozens of certification schemes, but there's not that shared view of across countries, between countries, of what that looks like. Supply and demand policies are also critically essential, especially at the country level, to accelerate use of these fuels. If I look at an accelerated case of all the policies that have been announced around the world, we could almost double supply and use of these fuels to 2030 from the main case. And critical to having these supply and demand policies are rewards for greenhouse gas performance. Those could be things like low carbon fuel standards or direct support for greenhouse gas reducing technologies. And finally, innovation and support for new technologies and processes is absolutely critical to start to build first-of-kind facilities and start to deploy these new technologies at scale. Now I'm going to go through some of the challenges and opportunities in the near term for sustainable fuels, and we'll start with liquid biofuels and feedstocks. Always the question of where are these fuels going to come from, what is supporting the growth of these fuels. For ethanol, we see the scale of ethanol demand growth matches with the new production of sugars and starches around the world. So that share of sugar and starches going to ethanol production stays fairly flat out to 2030. The same is not true for biodiesel, renewable diesel, and biojet feedstocks. So these are vegetable oils, the residue oils. In our main case, which is current policy settings, projects that have final investment decisions, we see a lot of pressure on these oils, and residue oils getting up to around 80% of collectible potential because they're very valuable. They help reduce emissions, and they can meet feedstock criteria in a number of jurisdictions. But this feedstock issue really needs to be addressed for the scale of growth that we would need from sustainable fuels. Now, one of the ways to address the feedstock issue is to commercialize new technologies. And we're starting to see some of these technologies come on around the world. And these are the ones on the right. So woody residues, which have a far larger base of feedstock potential around the world, alcohol to jet, which would allow ethanol to then be converted into jet fuel and offset some of the vegetable oil demand, and e-fuels, which then don't depend on bioresources for their production. Now, there's a cost question with these technologies. We know the new first-of-kind facilities will be more expensive, but when we look at what the cost of these technologies will be when deployed at scale, they match, at least within range of some of the commercial technology pathways today. Now, another way to address the feedstock supply issue is by improving the carbon intensity of fuels. In this situation, a more lower greenhouse gas intensity fuel requires less fuel to achieve the same greenhouse gas reduction. And we took a very close look last year at a lot of different sustainable fuel pathways for Brazil's G20 presidency. And one of the key conclusions from this work is that just about every sustainable fuel pathway has the ability to get to very low greenhouse gas intensities with the deployment of the right technologies and the right policy incentives. This is also a format that we think is useful for trying to gain some consensus around what sustainability means. Where do the different fuels fit on this metrics? The transport sector is quite advanced. There's lots of different policies around the world that try to assess greenhouse gas intensity. But when looking at sustainable fuels as a whole, uses in the industrial sector or uses as materials for fertilizer production, this type of approach can help to rate the different fuels against each other in some way that could be viewed consistently around the world. Some of our near-term policy priorities, and this is what we see as essential globally, but also play a role at setting policies at the country level. So number one is this clear global ambition. What is the role of sustainable fuels? And we're working with Brazil on this with COP30, and we worked with them as well during the G20. And there's also potential with Australia for COP31. The second one is to implement, expand supply and demand policies, especially in the maritime and aviation sectors. These areas are critical to start using sustainable fuels today so that we can have this large expansion out to 2050. We also like to see GHG performance embedded in these policies. This could be things like low carbon fuel standards or incentives that are linked to greenhouse gas performance. Fourth is seeking consensus on performance-based sustainability requirements. This helps to encourage trade of sustainable fuels, absolutely necessary for fuels that are used internationally. So thinking of CORSIA or the IMO in aviation and shipping. And it also helps to reduce the risk perception of sustainable fuels around the world, and so encourage investment in new facilities. And finally, we need continued support and expansion for new technologies and processes. And this isn't just to build new facilities, it's also on the upstream, on supply chains, on agriculture, to help expand the feedstock base and access a wider range of feedstocks. So I'll leave you there. I wish you all the best in the conversations today. I'm sorry I can't be there with you. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Emily Marthaler. It's nice to be with you all. I'm with Growth Energy, and I'm so glad I didn't put my picture up because that would be really creepy with a giant head of mine. But I'm excited to talk to you about ethanol. I find it so much fun. But, you know, when you talk about fuels of the future, hydrogen, moving towards new fuels, what's important to remember is that ethanol is available now, it's available immediately, and it's a proven technology that you can really start looking at relative to minimizing the risk for any future development of advanced technologies. So I'm with Growth Energy. For those of you who aren't aware, Growth Energy is the largest trade association of ethanol producers in the United States, and we produce 36 billion liters of ethanol production every year. So it definitely is proven relative to its use. So both the United States and Brazil and other countries around the Americas really recognize the role that agriculture can bring to provide the food, the feed, and the fiber that the world needs going forward. And over time, while we have used corn as the predominant source of ethanol production in the United States, it's really can use any starch or sugar-based commodity to produce ethanol. And over time, we have seen the efficiencies and improvements in corn that when you start looking at where ethanol was 10, 20, 15 and I know that's not in order, years ago, that, it's really expanded and improved in its efficiencies, so much so that it's not just corn ethanol use on road anymore. We're looking at animal feeds, valuable co-products that come from the ethanol process, as well as new uses for it. So both sustainable aviation fuel, health and safety, relative to things like hand sanitizer. So during COVID, everyone really started to see all these additional uses of chemical products. And these are valuable things that can really help and spur not just the biofuels industry, but new ways to utilize agriculture. And so I know there's a lot of concerns when you start talking about corn or sugarcane relative to food versus fuel. But because of this efficiency, we are seeing more uses. We are not, in the United States and in the Americas, we really recognize that corn, sugarcane, cassava, wheat, these things can lead to ethanol production, but you get co-products within them. And so remember, we're not protein deficient. We need a lot more. We need a lot more protein in this world, but so much of that is still left over after the ethanol process with animal feeds. So I just wanted to reference that. One of the things that they wanted me to reference here today was how really the state of low-carbon fuels in the U.S. and elsewhere. I think a lot of you are aware we've had an election in the United States, and the power shift has changed to a very different party. And so a lot of times that leads to questions, right? So what does that mean for biofuels in the United States? And the one great thing that I can say is that biofuels themselves in the U.S., but biofuels in a lot of countries in the Americas have bipartisan support. A lot of people support their use for a lot of different reasons. And so over time, what we'll see is not necessarily that support for biofuels changing, but we'll actually start seeing more things that are different in terms of language. How do you label policies? How those policies are used going forward. And so one thing that, and the reason for that, we do have a very strong support there. And part of the reason is because we do have kind of three general themes in the United States, Brazil, and other countries kind of recognize. And I'll talk more about these tomorrow. But really, you have to recognize that biofuels aren't, while they're an agricultural commodity, they're really more considered an energy commodity. And really understanding the gasoline industry, particularly during COVID, where you see a lot of those synergies being reknown to everybody. Supply, demand, and trade are really going to be important. But also relative to that, why are you using biofuels? Is it for just the price? Because you do get a lot of price competitiveness, but also in terms of fuel and additives. And it's also important as countries and Australia look at ways to develop the biofuels industry. A lot of countries have developed policies over the years. Over 70 countries have biofuels mandates or policies. However, if they're not effectively implemented, if there isn't an enforcement mechanism, it gets very hard to do over time. So really having that positive enabling environment is really important to recognize going forward. And so because of that, government support is needed, looking at what are those compelling reasons to use biofuels, to using ethanol. I know, Senator, you mentioned the idea of energy security, and so that is something that is very much ingrained in the U.S. policy, in the Brazilian policy, in a lot of these countries overseas, but so too is the economic and environmental reasons. And part of that reason why you have to have a strong enabling policy is just looking at the history of ethanol and why you need that. And no, don't worry, I'm not going through the whole history here. But I think over time, when ethanol was first started and used in the United States and elsewhere, it really kind of ebbed and flowed over time. You didn't have a strong demand for ethanol per se. But one thing I want to note here is in 1908, Henry Ford, when he first designed the U.S. automaker, when he first designed the car for everyday man, it was made and designed to run on ethanol, which is really exciting, partially because of the octane boost. And so, unfortunately, because there was no policy kind of supporting it, it ended when ethanol got more tax-based when Prohibition started in the United States, so no one wanted to drink alcohol. But I can just imagine how great it would be if we ended up using ethanol at the time. But, through this time, you kind of use ethanol use ebbed and flowed until the 1970s, and that's really the big point that I wanted to emphasize. In the 1970s, in the Western Hemisphere, in the U.S. and the Americas, and possibly also in Australia, you had significant supply constraints on gasoline coming into the U.S. and coming in elsewhere. You had OPEC leading to embargoes for oil. You led to supply constraints. And at that time, it really led to a lot of concerns on energy security, and with that, of course, national security. And so in the 1970s in the US as well as elsewhere, you had this underlying current of using more biofuels, homegrown energy. And Brazil also took this as an opportunity to develop their own biofuels policies. And they started in 1975, and over time, actually, some of those policies worked, some of them didn't. You had to repeal them. And I think the biggest point here to note is Brazil, like others, kept going at it. A lot of times people want to create the best policy. You want to create something that stops something from happening, and you want it to meet all of your goals. But let's be honest here, policy making is not easy. You come into it, you have an idea, you could put it forward, and you have to recognize all of the things may not work. So sometimes they worked, sometimes they were edited back, but over time you continue to have this presence and the support for biofuels policies no matter what. And because of that, over time, Brazil now blends at 27% ethanol, but E100 is also available. So you have the largest use of ethanol blending rate in the world. And they're looking to move to E30. And because of that kind of, since the 1970s, that undercurrent of support, they now produce about a quarter of the world's energy, or I'm sorry, the quarter of the world's ethanol. In the United States, it was a little bit similar, right? In the 1970s, we used more ethanol and used more biofuels, but that ebbed and flowed again. There was no underlining policy to continue the push. So in the 1990s and 2000s, early 2000s, very early 2000s, ethanol started to be used more and more by the oil companies. MTBE, leaded gasoline, was no longer allowed because of the environmental issues. So they started using ethanol for its octane enhancement. Because of that, octane was needed, not because of environmental reasons, not because of anything else, but they started to recognize the price and the octane abilities. In 2005, though, the U.S. Renewable Fuel Standard was created, and this is the underlying policy in the United States for biofuels, and it continues today. It's 20-year anniversary, and for this one, rather than setting a blend fuel or blend requirements like in Brazil, we also set a volumetric requirement. So biofuels producers can produce whatever it is, but the oil companies, those obligated parties, had to blend ethanol. And the purpose of the RFS, kind of back to this point, we have to recognize that to create a valuable policy, you need other reasons to support it. So bipartisanship, right? You had the Biden administration really support it for its environmental benefits. Perhaps this new administration looks at it from using our natural resources and helping supply of farmers utilizing that supply to energize the country. So, but within the actual act itself, it recognized not just the GHG emissions, but it also was the basis because of energy security. They wanted to use more homegrown fuels and as well as to decrease that use of fossil fuels. And that indeed is one of those important parts, because you can talk about greenhouse gas all you want and emissions, but at the heart of it, we also want to just decrease the use of gasoline. So it needs to be kind of remembered as countries look to develop biofuels policies. One of the big things here is to displace. So over time then, because of that, the United States since 2005, we really became a huge producer of ethanol in terms of the largest. We produce about half and consume about half of the global biofuels, particularly in ethanol. And one thing I wanted to note here is also what you saw over time is, energy security is important. But what also these policies look at is energy security is important, but also who you trade with is important too, right? So over time, during this policy, we recognized that we were going to be importing a lot more biofuels. And so you can kind of see over time our imports have changed to now we are a huge supplier to the world, and we export a lot more than we actually import. So over time, what we have seen, we've become a secure nation relative to biofuels. But of course, for Australia, you can see these things happening in Australia too over time. You have that enabling policy that's strong. The enforcement is there because the enforcement is part of that. And over time, yes, Australia may still import, but perhaps it's from other countries that you are more reliant on or more friendly with than perhaps some of the OPEC countries from before. But also in the United States over time, what we have seen, back to this idea, not every policy is the greatest thing out there, that over time you have to improve it. And E15 in the United States, or 15% ethanol blends, is one of those policies. We have started to see slower implementation of E15 than we would like. It has been approved in the US for about over 5 years now. Well, much longer than that, 13 years now. But its growth has really changed over time. But I think part of that, and we're hoping for it to continue to grow, the regulatory environment was why it was restricted, not because of other reasons, but just the regulatory environment. So we're still trying to improve that quite a bit. And this is one of those signs that we really need to not create the perfect policy, and I think that's sometimes the most difficult part. And so in addition to the United States and Brazil, but looking more beyond the federal, looking at state and provincial level is also something that's very important. So it's not just a federal policy that can help drive things. So in the United States, obviously, I think most people are aware of California's low carbon fuel policy, and it really helps to supplement and create added development of biofuels. And I think also Canada is a great example because nationally they have their clean fuel regulation, which is also starting to support the use of low carbon fuels by looking at what is their reduction. However, also in Canada, you are also seeing significant provincial changes. It's there both in British Columbia for SAF, but because of this CFR, the Clean Fuels Regulations, they need to use more low-carbon fuels. And those low-carbon fuels are going to be used through the provincial levels by having increasing blending. So you start to see a lower level of blending at the provincial level, but with the CFR, they're starting to change those quite a bit. And throughout the Americas, you also see that quite a number of countries are also producing more ethanol and looking at it from a way that they too can utilize their environment or utilizing their agricultural sector. So I'm happy to talk more about it, and you'll hear more on other things tomorrow, but thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you all.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Forshaw from Airbus, and I join others in paying my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. Can I also start by saying to Shahana and the team, congratulations on the 3rd Renewable Fuels Week. Bigger and better, and looking forward to a very insightful conference over the next few days. I have been giving a lot of thought to how our national security and resilience is impacted by our dependence on liquid fuels being imported from outside our country. It is one of the core reasons why Airbus, as a large European aerospace company, committed to working with Australia, working with partners in Australia, and in particular our customers at the Qantas Group, to stand up production of sustainable aviation fuel in this country. It is so important to the future of the aviation industry that we're able to not just decarbonise, but do it by standing up production here, close to where our customers require the fuel. It may be lost on people, but as a relatively small population centre in Australia, we are the 8th or 9th, depending on the year, the 8th or 9th largest consumer of aviation fuel in the world. When you think about that, it's because of the vast distances that we all travel frequently, and aviation is critical infrastructure in this part of the world. We don't have an issue about whether it's a good thing to be able to fly to play golf on the weekends like people do in Europe or even in parts of Asia. Aviation is absolutely critical to connect the communities within Australia, but also to our neighbours in the Pacific Islands, especially, that have very little access to goods and services without a critical aviation support network to be able to connect their countries with centres like Australia and New Zealand. So resilience and national security plays a really important part in how we think about the future of aviation. And I commend Bioenergy Australia for the report that was issued in conjunction with this conference around resilience. It highlighted some really interesting points, some of which I've been looking at in the context of aviation over the past couple of weeks in the lead up to this event. It showed that our dependence on imports is predominantly now from 3 countries, South Korea, Singapore and China. And I decided to look a little bit further into our dependence in the aviation industry on those imports, because one of the things I'd been talking about last year was if we don't do SAF production in Australia, we run the risk of not a future made in Australia, but a future made in Singapore. But actually it's not like that anymore. 2024 represented the first year where China's exports of aviation fuel to Australia crossed the 2 billion litre mark. 1 in 4 litres of jet fuel that we use in Australia now comes from China. So and imports have multiplied 4-fold in the last decade. So we're seeing a very dramatic shift to not just the fact that a large portion of our aviation fuel is now imported, but that actually an increasingly large portion of those imports are coming from China. Not 1 litre was imported in the last decade from the United States or from Europe. We are increasingly dependent on our neighbourhood in Asia, that makes sense, but we're increasingly dependent on parties that are not strategic partners with Australia in the future of our defence and sovereignty. So there are some serious questions that underlie why it's really important that we stand up production of fuel here in Australia, and we can do it. We have a huge opportunity. We have the biomass, we have the feedstock, we know that. We have the technology accessible to us, we know that. We have players that want to do this, we know that. What are we missing? We're missing the right policy settings. We're starting to see movement, and that's great, and I commend the government for putting some early funding into ARENA to start getting feasibility studies and very early stage work underway from the producers, such as Jet Zero, a company that ourselves and Qantas were very early investors in and have been back and invested a second time, because we see the opportunity for companies to stand up production, and we're willing to put our capital to work. We want to put more capital to work. If there are proponents in the room looking for funding, we are open to your proposals. I think we've heard from other speakers, there is funding ready to flow from all over the world to support standing up production of biofuels and other sustainable and renewable fuels in Australia, and I echo that as one of the providers of that capital. So the opportunity is there, but we need more supportive policy. I want to particularly commend Senator Van, who did move amendments in the Senate on the Future Made in Australia legislation only a couple of weeks ago, where he very specifically put proposals around production tax credits for sustainable aviation fuel. Now, it wasn't successful, but I'm not despondent about that. And I think it opens the conversation with both the government and the opposition on the importance of the right mechanisms to be able to deliver on support for production. My own view is if the right support processes are there, it will be a huge opportunity for Australia, not a huge cost. At the end of the day, production tax credits don't flow unless production flows. So it's not like we're going to be paying out unless we actually see production. But those right policy settings are absolutely critical for our country. As you've seen already, in 2010, we were actually importing only 18% of jet fuel into Australia. We're now importing, actually, it's somewhere between 80 and 90%, depending on the year. But let's also keep in mind that almost all of that fuel that we produce here, that small quantity of fuel we produce here, is produced itself from imported crude. So we are still dependent entirely on the import of fuel to Australia to support our aviation industry. I think we have shown in a report that ourselves and Qantas did through ICF what SAF production standing up will look like by 2050. It's a long road back to the point where we can get to imports of jet fuel being as low as 20% again. In 15 years, we've gone from 18% to nearly 90% imports. The road back is only going to happen if we can stand up production of sustainable fuels using the biomass we have here in Australia. I noted from the report that Bioenergy released yesterday or last night that already we're exporting $6 billion worth of feedstock. In some categories, we're exporting as much as 70 or 80% of the biomass that we will need to make those sustainable fuels in Australia. When I say the window is closing, in some senses, the window is getting very close to closed and locked. So we have a very limited window. When I press on people, and especially government, the urgency of getting the policy settings right, it's not because we can take our sweet time, it's because this is being done elsewhere now, today. These fuels are being made somewhere else. And if we don't stand up production here quickly, we'll lose the opportunity, and perhaps we'll lose even some of our higher quality feedstocks and be left with lower yielding feedstocks that's going to make it very harder for industry to compete and stand up. So the opportunity is a rich one for us. Partnerships will work to help deliver. We need the right policy settings, but if as an industry the policy settings are slow, we can't wait. So partnerships like the one we have with Qantas, where we're becoming a force multiplier with each other's capital, I think will have impact in helping to catalyse production, particularly from early stages. And I'd encourage others to use opportunities like the one that presents through this week to build more and stronger partnerships so that as an industry we can act as a force multiplier. At the end of the day, this standing up of production of SAF in Australia, and I include in this other renewable fuels for other sectors, can be our moonshot if we want it to be. We have such rich abundance of opportunity here with the feedstock we have. We have abundance of talent, and I'd love to see us seize that moonshot and take it to the next level so that we are actually a world superpower in the production of renewable liquid fuels. Thank you.
I'm feeling very inspired, Stephen. I'm very, very inspired. And look, I think what has been consistent in the narrative in this first session is the narrative that we need to be using around low carbon liquid fuels, in particular going into a federal election. As everybody, I think, mentioned in this session, we released a report last night that we've had a little bit of media on, which has been great, which is Securing Our Fuel Future, Resilience Through Low Carbon Liquid Fuels, produced by Deloitte. QR code up here, so for anyone that would like to access it. Really what that does is it speaks to our dependence on imported liquid fuels currently, but more so, it talks to the opportunity of what this presents. The report confirms even if electrification trends are maintained, Australia will still require 30 billion litres of liquid fuel in 2050. Interestingly, Emily, I think it was 36 billion litres a year of ethanol is produced in the US. So to give some perspective there, we can do this. We can definitely do it. The report states that Australia has the potential to produce 2 billion litres of low-carbon liquid fuels such as SAF and renewable diesel based on current projected pipeline projects by 2030. Now that represents 10% of our aviation fuel market. So this is on projects that have already been announced. We can supply 10% of our aviation fuel market. That's huge. You know, that's incredible, a fantastic opportunity. And with additional investment in refining and infrastructure to match Australia's feedstock potential, the report noted low carbon liquid fuel production could grow to displace 19% of imports by 2040 and up to 47% by 2050. We need to do this. We need to get this moving. Thank you, all of our speakers, for this morning, and thank you to Flyn and LanzaJet for sponsoring this session. To let everybody know, all of the breaks are going to be taking place in the auditorium glasshouse just outside here. And you'll notice on your lanyard, you've got some QR codes on there. So 4 sessions, we've got a bit of a chat room that's going on. So you can scan on the back of your lanyard. There is the program so that we're limiting our impact in terms of printing. But also there's a QR code for you to be able to ask questions of speakers. So speakers will be able to jump into that chat room for each of those sessions and answer questions. So encourage everybody who is unable to ask those questions to jump in there and to do that there. Once again, I would like to thank all of our sponsors for supporting this event, and we will all be coming back in here at 10:30 for the next session. Thank you so much, everyone.